People who have personally caught a predator, what did you do to them? My little sister was groomed and assaulted by a 41-year-old man when she was 11. He left her barely breathing and with enough internal damage so she would never have a menstrual cycle. To pour salt in the wound, when the day of sentencing came, the judge ruled that there was not enough evidence of intended bodily harm to give this monster more than 10 years. We were devastated. And to make matters even worse, he was let out on good behavior 48 months later. That's when he struck again. He tracked down another girl from our town. He assaulted and killed her in her own home. This time, our entire community went into uproar. We collectively got him served with not only a life sentence, but the death penalty too. But still, that didn't change the fact another family was destroyed. And when my little sister took her own life a few months later because of her trauma, I knew I had to start tracking these monsters down on my own. That night, I created a fake IG profile of a 14-year-old girl named Sophie. The amount of texts I received from grown men within just 72 hours made me want to throw up. I never told anyone about the account either. I simply texted these men, promised them a good time at a certain location. Then I'd meet them with crowbars and baseball bats, force them to beg for their life, before leaving them permanently disabled every time. I did that to 7 different men and never felt an ounce of remorse. But then I started texting a man named Grayson. He was very apprehensive about Sophie at first, saying he knew it was wrong, but it felt so right. Right around this time is when I noticed my older brother started acting strangely. He was 24 and had never been in love, but was suddenly smiling at his phone like a giddy teenager. He was oddly protective of it too. I'd sometimes tease him about his obvious new girlfriend, but instead of smiling or getting shy, he'd literally lock up and run to his room where he'd immediately change all the passwords to his phone and computer. The more secretive and addicted to his phone my brother got, the more Grayson became infatuated with Sophie. He started sending her money for manicures and shopping trips, which directly coincided with my brother picking up extra shifts at the warehouse job. Still, my brother's name was Benji, so I never thought anything. I continued leading Grayson on, spending 12 weeks wrapping him around my finger until he would have swam to Antarctica if Sophie told him to. I finally made my move when I asked him to meet me at the park at 1 a.m. He said yes immediately. I started getting dressed in all my black outfit around midnight when I heard my brother's door creak open. I listened to him go downstairs and exit as quietly as possible. I still thought he was going to another overnight shift. I gathered all my things, including my backpack and crowbar, and made my way to the park. I got there 15 minutes early and waited in the bushes. Sure enough, at exactly 1 a.m., I saw Grayson by the fence waiting for Sophie. That's when I made my move. The same thing I'd done 7 times. I snuck around the edges of the park so he wouldn't see me, and slowly started creeping up behind him. By the time I got to him, my crowbar was in my hand. I had no intention of anything less than breaking his legs. I tapped his shoulder softly. "Sophie," he said, turning around. That's when I saw his face, and my body froze. It was Benji, my brother. He went pale when he saw a man in a black mask staring at him. He couldn't tell who I was. All he knew was that this was a setup. He started running away like they always do. But this time I was too shocked to immediately chase him. I couldn't even process anything. I felt my body just take off after him. I eventually tackled him to the ground, where we ended up wrestling, and he stopped fighting after I pressed the crowbar against his neck. It was obvious he still didn't know who I was. I remember looking at him crying for mercy. That's when I just broke down sobbing. "How could you?" I yelled louder than I've ever yelled. He recognized my voice instantly. Jacob? He stammered out through tears. I ripped my mask off, and we stared at each other for what felt like forever. His hands started shaking, and he was hyperventilating. I remember hitting myself, convinced this was just a bad dream. But the more blood that poured out of me, the more I was forced to face the truth. My brother was one of them. I wrapped my crowbar around his neck, and his eyes burst open. Not out of fear, but like he was surprised I was actually hurting him. "I'm your brother," he said, gurgling his words. "You can't do this to me." I let go out of pure disbelief. He started talking about family loyalty and sticking together, and I just punched him. I couldn't take it. When he was on the ground again, I started screaming about our little sister. How she took her life because of monsters like him. That's when he said it. "How is any of that my fault?" He said it with a straight face. I remember losing it. I started wailing blows over and over, and when I was done, his jaw and his nose were both broken. I stood him up by his collar and told him one thing. "We're going back to the house, and you're gonna tell Mom and Dad what you did." 10 minutes later, we were at their door. "Hey, Mom, Benji has something to tell you." Mom's face went completely white the second she saw Benji's broken nose and the blood all down his shirt. Her hand flew to her mouth and she took a step back into the doorway while Dad appeared behind her, his eyes going wide as he looked between me and Benji. "What the hell happened?" Dad's voice came out sharp and confused. I pushed Benji forward a little bit, not hard, but enough to make him stumble toward them. "Benji needs to tell you what he's been doing online." The words came out flat and cold. Benji tried to talk through his busted jaw, the words coming out all wrong and mushy. "It's a misunderstanding. Jacob attacked me for no reason." Mom reached out toward him, but I stepped between them, blocking her path. "No, you need to hear this first before you comfort him." Dad pushed past both of us and grabbed Benji by the shoulders, looking at his injuries up close. Someone better start explaining right now. His voice kept getting louder with each word. I pulled out my phone and held it up. Benji's been sending money to someone he thought was a 14-year-old girl named Sophie, and he went to meet her at the park at 1 in the morning tonight. Mom's legs seemed to give out and she had to grab the door frame to stay standing. No, that can't be right. There's some mistake. Tears were already running down her face. Benji tried to say something about how he was just talking to her, that nothing bad happened, but the words came out all garbled through his broken teeth and swollen lips. I opened the screenshots on my phone and shoved it toward Dad. Look at these. 12 weeks of messages, hundreds of dollars in transfers, everything. Dad's hands started shaking as he scrolled through message after message, his face getting redder with each swipe. Mom had to sit down right there on the porch steps, her whole body shaking. We need to call the police right now, Dad said, already reaching for his phone. Mom grabbed his arm and pulled it down. Please wait. We should handle this as a family first, please. They started arguing right there in the doorway while Benji stood between them, bleeding onto the porch. If you don't call them, I will, I said, cutting through their argument. I reached into Benji's pocket and grabbed his phone before he could react, then walked straight into the house toward Dad's office. Benji tried to follow me, but I turned and pushed him back hard. Don't even think about it. I opened Dad's desk drawer and dropped the phone inside, then locked it with the key Dad kept on top of the bookshelf. The evidence stays safe, and tomorrow morning I'm going to the police station whether you come with me or not. Nobody slept that night. Not for a single minute. I could hear Mom crying through the walls, these deep, broken sobs that went on for hours. Dad paced downstairs all night, his footsteps going back and forth across the living room floor. I sat on my bed staring at the ceiling, seeing my little sister's face over and over, then seeing Benji standing at that park fence waiting for a child. My stomach kept turning and I threw up twice, barely making it to the bathroom. When morning finally came, we all ended up in the kitchen like zombies. Benji's face looked even worse in the daylight, purple and swollen all down one side. He started talking the second Dad sat down, saying we could handle this quietly, that going to the police would destroy our family forever. Dad's fist came down on the table so hard the coffee mugs jumped. The family is already destroyed! Mom just stared into her coffee cup, not moving, not speaking, like she wasn't even there anymore. I went back to my room and started making copies of everything, screenshots from the Sophie account, bank records I'd pulled up online showing Benji's extra warehouse shifts that matched perfectly with the payment dates to Sophie. My hands moved on their own, printing page after page while my brain kept going in circles. How did I not see this? How did I not know my own brother was one of them? The evidence pile grew bigger and bigger, each page another piece of proof that my brother was exactly like the monster who destroyed our sister. I organized everything into folders, one for the police, one for backup, one to keep at home. The printer ran out of ink halfway through, and I had to dig through Dad's office to find more, my hands shaking the whole time. Each screenshot showed Benji getting bolder, the messages getting worse, him talking about what he wanted to do when they finally met. My stomach heaved again, but nothing came up this time. I could hear Mom and Dad arguing downstairs about lawyers and family reputation and what the neighbors would think. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was stopping Benji before he found a real 14-year-old girl, before some other family ended up like ours. I kept printing and organizing, the mechanical work the only thing keeping me from completely losing it. Mom knocked on my door around noon and came in without waiting for an answer, her eyes red and puffy from crying all morning. She sat on the edge of my bed and watched me sorting papers into different folders, then asked if maybe we could wait just a few days before going to the police, just to figure things out as a family first. I kept organizing the evidence and told her that every single day we waited was another day Benji might find a real kid, not a fake profile, and hurt them the way our sister was hurt. She completely broke down then, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, and I had to help her to the bathroom where she threw up twice before collapsing on the floor. I left her there crying and went back to my computer, searching online for information about reporting these kinds of crimes. After about an hour of reading through different websites, I found a victim advocate office downtown that specialized in helping families navigate these situations. The website said they provided support through the entire legal process, helped with paperwork, and even went to court with families. It felt like exactly what we needed since none of us knew how to handle something this big. I bookmarked the page and wrote down their address and phone number on 3 different pieces of paper, putting one in my wallet, one in the evidence folder, and one on my desk. That evening after dinner, which nobody really ate, I went back to my room and started printing out all the chat logs between Benji and Sophie. I organized them chronologically, starting from the very first message where he said he knew it was wrong but couldn't help himself. Reading through them again made my stomach turn as I saw him describing in detail what he wanted to do to Sophie when they met. The reality of who my brother really was hit me in waves. First nausea that had me running to the bathroom, then rage that made me punch my wall so hard I left a hole. Page after page showed him getting bolder, talking about taking her places, buying her things, making her feel special before they did things she might not understand yet. I had to stop 3 times to go outside and breathe because the words on those pages were coming from someone I'd grown up with, shared a house with, trusted completely. When I finished organizing everything, I had a stack of papers 2 inches thick showing 12 weeks of grooming behavior. I found Benji alone in the garage later that night, sitting on Dad's workbench and staring at nothing. I confronted him about the money he'd sent to Sophie, holding up the bank records that showed every transfer. He insisted Sophie said she wanted the money for shopping and nails, like that somehow made it okay to send hundreds of dollars to a 14-year-old. His complete lack of understanding that she was supposed to be 14, that sending money to a child for any reason was wrong, made me realize he genuinely didn't see what was wrong with his actions. He kept saying she asked for it, she wanted it, she was mature for her age, all the same sick justifications I'd heard from the other men before I broke their legs. I wanted to hit him again, but instead I just left him there in the garage and went back to my room. I opened my laptop and logged into the Sophie Instagram account one last time, taking final screenshots of everything before starting the deletion process. After backing up every single message, photo, and interaction to 3 different drives, I went through the steps to permanently delete the account. Watching Sophie disappear felt strange, like I was erasing a person even though she never existed. The fake profile that started as revenge for my sister had exposed the monster living in our own house, sleeping down the hall from me. Part of me felt guilty about the deception, about pretending to be a kid to catch these men. But that guilt was nothing compared to knowing what Benji would have done if Sophie had been real. Before going to bed, I wrote a note on a piece of paper and left it on the kitchen counter where everyone would see it in the morning. The note said I was going to the police station at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning to file a report about Benji's online activities. I made it clear this wasn't a threat or a negotiation or something we were going to vote on as a family. This was simply what was going to happen, with or without their support. The next morning, I woke up at 7 a.m. and got dressed in clean clothes, making sure I looked presentable and serious. I drove downtown to the victim advocate office first, arriving right when they opened at 8 a.m. The receptionist gave me some forms to fill out and told me someone would be with me soon. Raylan Moore came out 15 minutes later, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She took me to her office and explained my rights as someone reporting a crime, what to expect from the legal process, and how their office could support me through everything. She was professional but warm, making me feel less alone in this nightmare for the first time in days. She gave me her card and said she could come with me to the police station if I wanted, which I immediately accepted. We walked the 3 blocks to the police station together, and she helped me navigate the front desk, asking specifically for someone who handled online predator cases. Detective Joel Vickers came out 20 minutes later, a tall man with gray hair who looked like he'd seen too much. He took us to an interview room and I handed over all the evidence I'd organized, the folders thick with screenshots and bank records. He reviewed the pages slowly, focusing on the screenshots where Benji acknowledged Sophie's age multiple times, saying things like 14 was the perfect age and that she was so mature for 14. Detective Vickers nodded grimly as he took notes, occasionally asking me to clarify dates or explain certain messages. After going through everything, Detective Vickers looked up and said there was clear, probable cause for multiple charges based on the evidence. The money transfers to someone Benji believed was a minor were especially damaging, along with his attempts to meet her in person. He explained they'd need to get a warrant for all of Benji's devices to look for additional evidence or other potential victims, which made my blood run cold thinking there might be real kids out there he'd contacted. I used the station phone to call Dad and tell him I'd made the official report. I could hear Mom sobbing in the background, these broken sounds that cut through the phone line. Dad said they would support whatever needed to happen, even though his voice sounded hollow and defeated, like someone had sucked all the life out of him. 3 days passed where I barely left my room except to eat and use the bathroom. My phone buzzed while I was staring at the ceiling and Detective Vickers' name popped up on the screen. I answered and he told me the warrant for Benji's electronics got approved by the judge that morning. He said once they served it, everything would get real fast and asked if I was ready for that. I told him yes, even though my hands were shaking. He said they'd go to our house that afternoon while Benji was at work. I hung up and went downstairs where Mom was sitting at the kitchen table looking at old photo albums. She'd been doing that a lot lately, staring at pictures from when we were kids. I told her the police were coming to search Benji's room, and she just nodded without looking up. Around 2 o'clock, 3 police cars pulled up outside, and Detective Vickers knocked on the door with 4 other officers behind him. Dad let them in and showed them to Benji's room while Mom watched from the hallway. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in just 1 week. The officers put on gloves and started bagging Benji's laptop, his tablet, 2 old phones from his desk drawer, and a bunch of USB drives and external hard drives. They took pictures of everything first and made Dad sign papers saying what they took. One officer found another laptop under Benji's bed that even Dad didn't know about. They loaded everything into evidence bags and boxes, carrying them out to their cars while our neighbors watched from their windows. Mrs. E. Henderson from next door was standing on her porch pretending to water plants that were already soaked. The whole search took about an hour, and when they left, Mom went to her room and didn't come out for the rest of the day. 4 days went by before Detective Vickers called again. I was eating cereal when my phone rang and his voice sounded grim. He said their tech people found a lot on Benji's devices. There were more explicit messages, more payment records going back months, and worst of all, evidence he was talking to other profiles that might be real kids. My cereal turned to paste in my mouth, and I had to spit it out in the sink. He said they found at least 3 other Instagram accounts Benji was messaging, all claiming to be young girls between 12 and 15. The payments totaled over $8,000 across different apps like Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal. I threw my bowl in the sink so hard it cracked. The next morning, Benji showed up at the house with a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Kara Espinoza, his lawyer. She sat in our living room and told my parents I'd entrapped Benji, and that would get the whole case thrown out. Detective Vickers had warned me she might try this, so I called him right there in front of her. He was at the house 20 minutes later and explained that entrapment only applies when law enforcement does it, not private citizens. He said what I did might be ethically questionable, but it didn't invalidate the evidence of Benji's crimes. Espinoza's face got tight, and she whispered something to Benji before they left. That same afternoon, Raylan Moore called and asked me to come to her office. I drove there and she sat me down with a serious look on her face. She told me I needed to stop all vigilante activities immediately if I hadn't already. She said if I kept going after predators on my own, it could complicate Benji's case and maybe even get me arrested. She said the defense could use it to paint me as unstable or violent, which would hurt the prosecution. I promised her I was done with all that, and I meant it. I felt too tired and empty to even think about hunting anyone else. A week later, Detective Vickers called with more news. The forensic analyst had recovered deleted conversations from Benji's computer, stuff he thought was gone forever. There were detailed plans to meet at least 2 other young profiles, including addresses and times. One conversation had Benji describing exactly what he wanted to do when they met, and I had to hang up because I was going to throw up. I ran to the bathroom and dry heaved over the toilet while Dad knocked on the door asking if I was okay. The scope of what my brother had been doing was so much bigger than just Sophie. He'd been hunting kids for who knows how long. Mom couldn't take it anymore and packed a bag the next day. She said she was going to stay with her sister in the next town over because she couldn't be in the house where Benji lived. She hugged me before she left, but it felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions. Dad started picking up extra shifts at his job, leaving before sunrise and coming home after dark. The house felt empty with just me rattling around in it. I started sleeping on the couch because going upstairs meant walking past Benji's room. Raylan gave me a referral to see Marshall Knox, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and violence. His office was in a small building downtown, just a regular room with 2 chairs and a desk. Our first session, I sat there for 20 minutes without saying anything while he waited patiently. When I finally started talking, I could barely get the words out about what I'd done to those 7 men. I told him about the crowbars and baseball bats, about leaving them broken and bleeding. He didn't judge me or look shocked, just nodded and took notes. We spent 3 sessions before I could even mention finding out about Benji. During our 4th session, Marshall asked me what scared me most about this whole situation. I told him I was afraid I might be capable of becoming like the men I hunted. He helped me see that the violence I'd inflicted in the name of justice had left its own scars on my psyche. I told myself I was different because I was protecting kids, but I'd still chosen violence as my solution. We talked about how anger can consume you until you don't recognize yourself anymore. 2 weeks after the search, Detective Vickers called to say the prosecutor had reviewed everything and they were planning to arrest Benji next week. He warned me that once they arrested him, the media would probably pick up the story. He asked if I was ready for reporters and cameras and having our family business all over the news. I hadn't even thought about that part. The idea of everyone in town knowing made me want to disappear. Tuesday morning came faster than I expected, and Detective Vickers called at 7 a.m. to let me know they were heading to the warehouse. I sat in my car outside Benji's workplace, watching police cruisers pull into the parking lot around 8:30. 20 minutes later, they walked him out in handcuffs while his coworkers pressed against the windows watching everything unfold. Benji kept his head down, but I could see his hands shaking as they put him in the back of the patrol car. Detective Vickers texted me later saying Benji went quietly, but looked shocked it was actually happening, like he thought somehow this would all just go away. The arraignment happened 3 days later at the courthouse downtown, and I sat in the back row watching Prosecutor Hudson Silva read out the charges. Online solicitation of a minor, transfer of funds for illegal purposes, attempted child endangerment. Each charge made my stomach turn knowing these were things my own brother did. Benji stood there in an orange jumpsuit while his lawyer, Kara Espinoza, entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, even though we all knew the evidence was overwhelming. The judge set bail at $50,000 and issued a protective order requiring Benji to stay away from schools, parks, and anywhere children gather. He also couldn't use social media or dating apps while the case was pending, and had to install monitoring software on any devices he used. Dad put up the house as collateral to post bail, which made Mom cry harder than I'd seen since our sister died. That afternoon, I met Detective Vickers at the station and handed over my crowbar and the black clothes I wore that night at the park. My hands were sweating as I passed them across the desk, terrified about my own legal exposure for attacking those 7 men. Detective Vickers put everything in evidence bags and told me they'd focus on Benji's case for now, but I should probably get a lawyer too. I found one through Raylan's office, an older guy who specialized in self-defense cases, and when Detective Vickers asked about the 7 men I'd disabled, my lawyer immediately told me not to provide any details yet. The conflict between wanting to confess everything and protecting myself was eating me alive every single day. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about those men I'd left broken and bleeding, wondering if any of them had reported me to police. My therapy sessions with Marshall became twice a week because I couldn't handle the guilt and anger mixing together in my head. We spent an entire session just working through that night at the park, unpacking the exact moment I realized Grayson was actually Benji. Marshall had me close my eyes and walk through every detail, from seeing the fence to tackling my brother to pressing the crowbar against his neck. The betrayal felt like losing my sister all over again, another family member destroyed by this evil that seemed to infect everything it touched. A week later, Mom's letter arrived at my apartment, her handwriting shaky as she begged me not to testify against Benji. She wrote that it would kill her to see one son send the other to prison, that our family had already lost too much. I didn't respond but kept the letter in a folder with all the other evidence, another piece showing the impossible position I was stuck in. Raylan spent hours teaching me about victim impact statements and how to set boundaries with family members who wanted me to stay quiet. She helped me understand that choosing justice over family pressure wasn't betrayal, but actually protecting future victims from what Benji might do. She showed me statistics about repeat offenders and how they escalate when they don't face consequences, which made me think about that monster who hurt my sister and then killed another girl. 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Hudson Silva called to tell me that Kara Espinoza had approached him about a plea deal. She was claiming Benji made a one-time mistake and deserved leniency since he hadn't actually touched anyone yet. Hudson shared the offer with me, and I spent the next 3 hours sending him more evidence about the pattern of behavior, the deleted conversations the forensic analyst found, everything showing this wasn't some isolated incident. Hudson thanked me for the information and asked me to preserve all records but avoid posting anything online about the case. The urge to expose Benji publicly was so strong I had to delete all my social media apps just to stop myself from ruining the prosecution. Every time I saw a post about protecting kids or internet safety, I wanted to comment about what my own brother had done, but I followed Hudson's rules because I couldn't risk messing up the case. The preliminary hearing got scheduled for next month, and Hudson warned me I'd probably have to testify about finding the messages and confronting Benji at the park. The thought of sitting in that witness chair describing everything while Benji watched made me physically sick, but I knew I had to do it for my sister and for Sophie, and for every other kid these monsters target. The forensic analyst sent Hudson Silva the full report 3 days later, and it destroyed every single excuse Benji had been making. The metadata showed clear timestamps from when Sophie first told him she was 14 years old on day 1 of their conversations. Every message after that point proved he knew exactly what he was doing, including the ones where he told her age didn't matter because their connection was special. Hudson called me to go over the findings and showed me screenshots where Benji actually coached Sophie on what to say if anyone asked about their relationship. The evidence was so damning that even Kara Espinoza stopped trying to claim it was entrapment and started pushing for a mental health defense instead. I was sitting in my apartment looking at the report when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text said I was a snitch who betrayed family and that snitches get what's coming to them in this town. My hands shook as I took a screenshot and immediately forwarded it to Detective Vickers, who called me back within 5 minutes. He said the threat could be from someone in Benji's online community since they'd been monitoring several forums where guys share tips about meeting young girls. Detective Vickers came to my apartment that afternoon with paperwork for a protective order and said they'd already traced the number to a burner phone bought with cash. He helped me fill out all the forms while explaining they'd increase patrols near my building and my parents' house just to be safe. The whole process took 2 hours, and I noticed how calm I felt compared to the rage that would have consumed me just weeks ago. 3 days later, I had my regular session with Marshall where we worked through the guilt I felt about my sister. He had me write down all the things I wished I could have done differently to protect her from that first monster. We talked about how my vigilante actions came from a place of pain, but had created their own kind of damage. Marshall helped me see that beating up those 7 men didn't bring my sister back, and might have actually put other kids at risk if those guys wanted revenge. I was learning to separate the need for accountability from the destructive need for personal vengeance that had been eating me alive. My phone rang that evening, and Dad's name appeared on the screen. He said Mom wanted to have a family meeting with Benji present to work through everything as a family. Then he dropped the real bomb that Benji wanted an apology from me for breaking his nose and jaw that night at the park. I told Dad absolutely not, that I wouldn't sit there and make Benji feel better about being a predator. Dad tried to explain that Mom thought healing could only happen if we all took responsibility for our parts, but I cut him off. I said Benji had shown zero real remorse and only cared about his own pain, not what he'd done to our family or tried to do to a child. The pretrial hearing happened 2 weeks later at the courthouse downtown. I sat in the gallery watching Benji walk in wearing a suit and tie like he was some respectable businessman instead of a predator. The judge reviewed all the evidence Hudson presented, including the forensic report, the money transfers, and the messages planning to meet Sophie. Benji kept his head down the whole time while Kara Espinoza argued for reduced charges based on the fact that no actual child was harmed. The judge scheduled the actual trial for next month and denied Espinoza's motion to reduce bail. After the hearing, Hudson pulled me aside in the hallway with news that made my stomach drop. They'd found evidence on Benji's devices suggesting he'd been talking to at least one real 14-year-old girl in another state. The messages were similar to what he'd sent Sophie, but this girl had stopped responding after he asked for photos. Hudson said they were working with police in that state to track down the girl and make sure she was okay. The case was getting bigger than just my fake profile, and the thought that Benji might have hurt a real kid made me want to throw up. That night, I tried to start writing my impact statement about how Benji's actions connected to our sister's death. I got 3 sentences in before I broke down completely, unable to put into words how his betrayal felt like losing her all over again. Marshall met with me the next day and suggested we write it in pieces over several sessions instead of trying to do it all at once. We started with just describing who my sister was before the assault, then slowly worked toward the harder parts about her trauma and death. The process was brutal, but Marshall kept reminding me that the statement wasn't just about punishment, but about making sure the judge understood the full weight of what predators do to families. Detective Vickers called me a week later with something that sent ice through my veins. He mentioned casually that one of the men I'd disabled had given police a description of his attacker months ago. The guy described someone my height and build wearing all black with a crowbar, and Vickers said the description could match me. Fear crawled up my spine as I realized my vigilante past might finally be catching up with me. Vickers didn't directly accuse me, but the way he brought it up felt like a warning that I needed to get ahead of this. I scheduled a meeting with Raylan Moore the next morning to talk about my options. She laid out 2 paths. I could self-report the attacks now and try to control the narrative, or wait to see if they officially connected me to them. Raylan explained that coming forward voluntarily would look better to prosecutors and might lead to more lenient treatment. We spent 3 hours going through the pros and cons while she helped me understand that taking responsibility on my own terms was different from being caught. I left her office leaning heavily toward coming forward, but terrified of what it would mean for my future. That same night, I sat at my laptop and started deleting Sophie from everywhere I could think of. I went through Instagram first, then Gmail, then the cloud backups on 3 different services. Each deletion felt like erasing a piece of the trap that caught Benji, but Hudson already had all the screenshots and evidence he needed. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard, clearing browser histories and cached files while my stomach stayed tight. The fake profile that started everything was finally gone after 2 hours of careful deletion. 3 days later, Hudson called me to his office to discuss Benji's options. He laid out papers showing all the evidence they'd collected from Benji's devices and my Sophie account. The prosecutor explained they could offer Benji a plea deal instead of going to trial where he'd face worse charges. The deal meant pleading guilty to felony solicitation, lifetime sex offender registration, mandatory therapy, and 5 years of strict probation. Hudson said it was less than Benji deserved, but more realistic than hoping a jury would convict on the heavier charges. I nodded and tried not to think about how 5 years felt like nothing compared to what our sister went through. Hudson then shifted the conversation to my own situation with the 7 men I'd attacked. He said my cooperation with Benji's case would help, but I needed to prepare for possible assault charges. The prosecutor explained that coming forward voluntarily would look better than being caught later. He gave me a week to think about it while Benji considered the plea deal. The next morning was the family mediation session that Raylan had arranged at the courthouse. Mom and Dad sat on one side of the table, while I sat on the other with Raylan beside me. The mediator started by asking everyone to share their feelings about the situation. Dad's hands shook as he finally spoke up after 20 minutes of Mom crying. He said he'd noticed weird things about Benji over the years, but always made excuses. There was the time he found Benji looking at young girls' social media profiles late at night, or when Benji got defensive about his phone and computer passwords. Dad's voice cracked as he admitted he should have asked questions instead of looking away. Mom couldn't stop sobbing as she listened to Dad list all the warning signs they'd ignored. I sat there feeling the weight of being the one who forced everyone to see what they'd been avoiding. The mediator helped us talk through boundaries and next steps, while Mom kept asking how she failed as a mother. After the mediation, I went straight to the police station with the formal statement I'd written. My hands were sweating as I handed the paper to Detective Vickers, acknowledging I'd engaged in violent acts against multiple individuals. I didn't provide specific names or dates yet, just admitted to the attacks in general terms. Vickers read it slowly, then looked up and said this was the right thing to do. He explained the next steps would involve more detailed statements and possibly identifying the victims. 2 weeks passed before Kara called Hudson to say Benji would accept the plea deal. She'd explained to Benji that the evidence was overwhelming, and if they found any real victims, the charges would multiply. Benji finally understood he had no chance at trial and agreed to plead guilty to avoid worse consequences. Hudson called me immediately to let me know, and I felt nothing but a deep, hollow ache in my chest. There was no satisfaction in winning, because it meant accepting my brother really was a predator. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month at the county courthouse. Marshall helped me prepare my victim impact statement over several therapy sessions, working through each painful paragraph. When the day came, I stood at the podium with shaking hands holding my statement. I talked about our sister first, describing who she was before the assault destroyed her childhood. Then I explained how her suicide wasn't just from one predator, but from a world that kept producing them. My voice shook when I connected Benji's actions to perpetuating the same cycle that killed our sister. I had to stop twice to breathe through the anger and grief washing over me. The courtroom was silent, except for Mom's quiet crying in the back row. The judge listened carefully, then accepted the plea agreement Hudson had negotiated with Kara. 5 years probation with electronic monitoring for the first 2 years. Lifetime registration as a sex offender with quarterly check-ins. Mandatory therapy twice a week for the first year, then weekly after that. No contact with minors, including supervised situations. No internet access without monitoring software installed. Benji would also pay $10,000 in restitution to victim services and could never work in any job involving children. The judge's gavel came down, and Benji was let out to process his probation paperwork. The next day, Hudson called me back to discuss my own legal situation regarding the vigilante attacks. He offered me deferred adjudication for one assault charge if I cooperated fully about all 7 attacks. This meant 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory therapy continuation. If I completed everything successfully, there'd be no permanent criminal record. Hudson explained this was generous considering what I'd done to those men. He said my cooperation with Benji's case and voluntary confession helped, but I'd still face serious requirements. I had 24 hours to decide whether to accept or risk going to trial myself. That night I barely slept, weighing the deal against the possibility of worse charges later. The next morning I called Hudson and accepted the deferred adjudication agreement he'd offered. 2 years probation with monthly check-ins, 200 hours of community service at approved organizations, continued therapy with Marshall twice a month minimum. No contact with any of the 7 victims, though their names stayed sealed in the agreement. Random drug tests and home visits from my probation officer. I signed the papers that afternoon, feeling both relieved and humbled by how fair the deal was considering everything. My first community service assignment came 3 weeks later at Lincoln High School, where I had to talk to 200 juniors about online predators. I stood at the front of the gym with my hands shaking, looking at all those faces that reminded me of my sister at that age. I stuck to the facts, showing them screenshots with names blacked out, explaining how predators start with normal conversations, then slowly push boundaries. I told them about the money transfers, the late-night meeting requests, the way these men always claim the kid is mature for their age. When one girl asked if I knew anyone personally affected by this stuff, I just said yes, and moved on to warning signs parents miss. After the presentation, 12 different students came up to thank me for being real with them, and 3 admitted they'd been getting weird messages from older guys online. The principal asked if I could come back next month, and I agreed, even though talking about this stuff made me want to throw up every single time. 2 days later, I drove to Riverside Cemetery where my sister was buried next to our grandmother. I sat on the grass next to her headstone and talked for 2 hours straight, telling her everything about Benji, about what I did to those 7 men, about the plea deals and probation. I explained how I couldn't promise her peace or justice because those things didn't really exist, but I promised to keep fighting the right way now through legal channels and education. I left fresh daisies on her grave, the flowers she used to pick from our backyard before everything went dark. Mom called that night to tell me she and Dad had started couples therapy with someone who specialized in families dealing with sexual abuse trauma. She said they decided Benji wasn't welcome at any family gatherings while on probation, not even holidays or birthdays. Dad got on the phone and his voice cracked when he said they should have protected us better, should have seen the signs with Benji. I told him nobody could have known, but we both knew that wasn't completely true. That weekend, I spent 14 hours going through my computer and phone, deleting every file and draft related to my vigilante activities, except what law enforcement specifically required me to keep. I found notebooks full of plans, screenshots of conversations with those 7 men, detailed maps of meeting locations. Shredding those pages felt like ripping off a piece of my identity, but Marshall had been clear that holding on to that stuff would keep me stuck in that mindset. I burned everything in the backyard fire pit, watching 3 years of revenge planning turn to ash and smoke. Marshall noted my progress during our session the following week, saying my anger seemed more controlled and my PTSD symptoms were responding well to the medication we'd adjusted. He said the rage that used to consume every thought had transformed into something more focused, more productive. We worked through breathing exercises and grounding techniques for when the anger tried to take over. After 6 months of twice-weekly sessions, he reduced our meetings to once a week, saying I was making real progress. The Victim Advocacy Training Program application sat on my desk for 3 weeks before I finally filled it out. Raylan Moore wrote me a recommendation letter that made me cry, saying she'd watched me grow from someone consumed by vengeance to someone committed to helping others navigate trauma legally and safely. The program director called 2 weeks later to schedule an interview, warning me they'd need to do extensive background checks given my history. I passed everything and got accepted for the next training cohort starting in September. Dad showed up at my apartment one Saturday morning with a truck full of gardening supplies, saying he wanted to build something beautiful for my sister. We spent every weekend for 2 months digging up the backyard, laying stone paths, planting purple irises and yellow roses and white lilies. Mom joined us sometimes, usually just sitting on the porch watching, but occasionally she'd help place stones or water the new plants. We'd talk about my sister's laugh, her terrible jokes, the way she used to name every butterfly that visited our yard. Nobody mentioned Benji during these conversations, like his name would poison the memorial we were creating. The garden grew into something magnificent, with a small bench where you could sit surrounded by flowers she would have loved. 9 months after that night at the park, everything looked completely different. I worked 35 hours a week as a victim advocate assistant, helping families fill out paperwork and understand court procedures. My probation officer said I was one of her most compliant cases, never missing a check-in or community service hour. The families I worked with didn't know my full history, just that I understood what they were going through. Our family existed in a new configuration now, broken and rearranged, but somehow still standing. We built something different from the ruins, not perfect or whole, but honest and grounded in truth instead of the denial that almost destroyed us. Every day required choosing to move forward instead of backward, choosing legal advocacy over vigilante justice, choosing to honor my sister through legitimate work instead of violence. So yeah, that's it. Nothing too fancy, just how it played out. Thanks for tagging along, and I'll catch you again if you swing back by.